The mountain valley had never seen anything like it. Clarissa stood 15 feet tall in her white lace gown, her veil cascading down like a waterfall of silk. She was a giant, born from the old bloodline that had lived in these peaks for generations. Her people were few now, scattered across distant ranges, but today she would marry outside her kind for the first time in recorded history. The man waiting at the altar was Jack Wheeler, a cowboy who barely reached her knee. The townsfolk of Redemption Creek had gathered in uneasy silence. They whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes darting between the massive bride and the determined groom. Jack stood tall despite his size, his weathered face set with resolve. His boots were polished, his black suit pressed, and his hat sat perfectly on his sun-bleached hair. He had loved Clarissa since the day she saved his cattle from a flash flood, lifting them to safety with her bare hands while the water raged below. The ceremony proceeded with strange beauty. The minister, standing on a specially built platform, spoke the ancient words. When Jack said his vows, his voice carried clear and strong across the wooden church. Clarissa's response trembled with emotion, her massive hands clasped nervously at her waist. She had never imagined finding love, convinced her size made her a curiosity rather than a woman worthy of devotion. But Jack had seen past dimensions and measurements to the gentle soul within. As they exchanged rings, the ground beneath them suddenly shuddered. A low rumble echoed from deep within the mountain. The guests stumbled, grabbing pews for support. Clarissa's eyes widened with recognition and fear. She knew that sound. Her grandfather had warned her about it years ago, before he passed into legend. It was the awakening of something ancient, something that slept in the hollow chambers far below the valley floor. The tremor subsided, but tension replaced celebration. Jack squeezed his bride's finger, the only part of her hand he could fully grasp, and smiled up at her. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The minister rushed through the final blessing, pronouncing them husband and wife. The kiss was awkward and tender, Clarissa bending low while Jack stood on his toes, their union sealing something more than just two hearts. It marked the beginning of a partnership that would be tested before the sun set on their wedding day. As the guests filed out into the afternoon light, another tremor struck, stronger than before. Cracks appeared in the church floor. An old farmer pointed toward the mountain with a shaking hand. Dark smoke was rising from a crevice near the summit, something that had never existed before. The mountain was opening, revealing a wound in the earth that exhaled the breath of ages. Clarissa's face went pale, her freckles standing out starkly against her skin. She turned to Jack with tears forming in her enormous blue eyes. "It's the heart chamber," she whispered, her voice like distant thunder. The legend was true. When a giant binds their life to someone outside the bloodline, the mountain responds. It's testing whether the bond is strong enough to maintain the old magic that keeps this valley alive. If we fail, everything dies, the streams, the forests, the land itself. Jack processed this revelation with the calm of a man who had faced stampedes and storms. He adjusted his hat and looked up at his bride with unwavering determination. "Then we don't fail," he said simply. "Tell me what needs to be done." Clarissa explained that one of them must descend into the heart chamber, a vertical shaft that dropped into the mountain's core. There, they would need to reach the crystal root, an ancient formation that channeled life energy throughout the valley. The root had to be touched, claimed, and bound with their joined essence. It was a journey meant for giants, navigated by size and strength. But the magic demanded both of them. It demanded proof of their unity. The entrance to the heart chamber lay 3 miles up the mountain, accessible only by a treacherous path that wound through loose scree and jutting rock. Clarissa carried Jack in one hand as she climbed, her wedding dress hiked up and tied at her knees. The fabric was already torn and stained with mountain dust, the lace catching on branches and thorns. She moved with surprising grace despite her size, her giant strength making the ascent look effortless. But Jack could feel the tension in her grip, the fear that radiated from her like heat. They reached the crevice as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The opening was jagged and wide, easily accommodating Clarissa's frame. Dark air flowed from within, carrying the smell of ancient stone and something else, a mineral scent that made Jack's nose tingle. Clarissa set him down gently on a flat rock and knelt beside him, her face level with his. Up close, her features were delicate despite their scale, her eyes reflecting the dying light like pools of clear water. The shaft dropped straight down for nearly 200 feet, she explained, her breath warm against him. "I can climb down using the natural handholds. My people did it for generations during the old ceremonies. But Jack, the crystal root sits in a crevice too narrow for me to reach. My grandfather's journal described it, a gap in the rock no wider than a man's shoulders. That's why the magic brought us together. You have to be the one to reach it. Jack understood immediately. Clarissa would carry him down into the depths, navigating the vertical descent with her giant strength. But the final approach required human dimensions. He would have to crawl into a space where she couldn't follow, alone in the dark, to claim the crystal root on behalf of their union. The thought sent cold sweat down his spine, but he nodded without hesitation. They began the descent as twilight deepened above. Clarissa lowered herself into the shaft, her fingers finding holes that had been carved smooth by countless giant hands over millennia. Jack clung to her shoulder, one hand gripping the fabric of her dress, the other holding a rope tied around her neck like a massive necklace. She had fashioned a harness for him, but he'd insisted on maintaining contact, feeling safer pressed against her than dangling in the void. The darkness swallowed them completely within minutes. Clarissa moved by feel and memory, her giant eyes adapted to see in conditions that left Jack completely blind. He felt the displacement of air as they passed through wider chambers, then the compression as the shaft narrowed. Her breathing echoed around them, steady and controlled despite the exertion. Once, her foot slipped, and they dropped several feet before she caught herself. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs, but he didn't cry out. He trusted her completely. "Talk to me," Clarissa said softly, her voice surrounding him in the enclosed space. "Tell me something about your life before. I need to hear your voice." So Jack talked. He told her about growing up on a failing ranch, about learning to rope and ride before he could properly read. He described the loneliness of the open range, the beauty of cattle moving like a river across grassland, the satisfaction of honest work under an honest sun. He talked about the day he first saw her, this impossible woman who moved mountains and carried kindness in her giant heart. His voice kept them both anchored as they descended into the earth's embrace. They reached the bottom after what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 minutes. Clarissa's feet touched solid ground, and she carefully lowered Jack beside her. The chamber here was vast, a cathedral carved by nature and time. Faint luminescence came from veins of crystal embedded in the walls, giving off a ghostly blue glow. The light revealed their destination, a narrow crack in the far wall, barely visible, weeping moisture that had never seen sunlight. Clarissa pointed toward the crevice with a trembling hand. "There," she said. "The crystal root lies 20 feet inside that passage. You'll know it when you see it. It pulses with light, growing brighter as you approach. You must place both hands on it and speak our names together. The magic will do the rest." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "Jack, the passage is unstable. The ceiling is fractured. One wrong move could bring it down. And it's so tight that if you get stuck, I can't reach in to pull you out." Jack studied the opening, measuring it with his eyes. It would be a squeeze, requiring him to crawl on his belly, arms extended forward. No room to turn around. If something went wrong, his only option would be to keep going forward or die trying to retreat. He checked his belt, ensuring his knife was secure and his small lantern had fuel. Clarissa had prepared him with supplies, rope, matches, a canteen of water. But none of that would matter if the mountain decided to close its fist. He turned to his wife and reached up to touch her face. She lowered herself until they were eye to eye, and he saw fear there, raw and honest. "I'll come back to you," he promised. "We didn't survive everything else just to fail here." Jack approached the crevice with his lantern held high, its weak flame casting dancing shadows on the wet stone. The opening was even narrower than it had appeared from a distance, barely wide enough for his shoulders if he turned sideways. He glanced back at Clarissa one final time. She had settled herself against the chamber wall, her knees drawn up, looking impossibly vulnerable despite her size. Their eyes met across the distance, and no words were necessary. He turned and stepped into the crack. The passage grabbed him immediately, stone pressing against his chest and back simultaneously. He had to shuffle sideways, his boots scraping along the narrow floor. Water dripped constantly from above, running down his neck and soaking through his wetting shirt. The temperature dropped sharply, his breath fogging in the lantern light. Within 10 feet, the passage angled slightly downward and became tighter still. Jack had to stop, set the lantern ahead of him, and work his way forward with deliberate movements. His world became reduced to inches and breathing. The stone scraped his ribs with every expansion of his lungs. Panic threatened at the edges of his mind, the primal fear of being trapped, buried alive in the mountain's grip. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to focus on the goal ahead. 20 feet total distance, Clarissa had said. He'd covered maybe 12. Keep moving. Keep pushing forward. The passage made a sharp bend, forcing him to contort his body at an awkward angle. His shoulder wedged against a protrusion, and for one terrible moment, he couldn't move forward or back. Cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He twisted, feeling fabric tear as his shirt caught on the rough stone. His shoulder scraped raw, but he gained an inch. Then another. The protrusion released him, and he gasped with relief. The lantern flickered ahead, its fuel running low. Jack realized with growing dread that he might have to complete this journey in absolute darkness. He moved faster, disregarding the scrapes and bruises accumulating on his body. The passage opened slightly, enough that he could bring his arms down to his sides instead of extended forward. Progress improved. His fingers touched something different, smooth stone that felt almost warm compared to the surrounding rock. Then he saw it. Light pulsed in the darkness ahead, a rhythmic glow that matched the beating of a heart. Blue-white luminescence filled the end of the passage, revealing a small chamber no bigger than a horse stall. And there, growing from floor to ceiling like a frozen lightning bolt, stood the crystal root. It was magnificent and terrible, a formation of pure quartz shot through with veins of something that glowed within a fire. The light intensified as Jack approached, responding to his presence. He emerged into the chamber and stood fully upright for the first time in what felt like hours. His body ached, his clothes were shredded, and blood seeped from a dozen scrapes. But none of that mattered. He was here. He'd reached the heart of the mountain's mystery. The crystal root towered above him, easily 12 feet tall and as thick as a tree trunk. Its surface was covered in natural facets that refracted light in all directions, creating a display of beauty that took his breath away. Jack moved closer, drawn by the pulsing energy. He could feel it now, a vibration that resonated in his bones. This was life itself, concentrated and crystallized by ages beyond counting. It fed the valley above, sustained the forests and streams, maintained the delicate balance that allowed the remaining giants to survive. And now it waited for him to claim it, to bind it to his union with Clarissa. He extended his hands toward the crystal's surface. Heat radiated from it, not burning but intense enough to make him hesitate. He thought of Clarissa waiting in the dark chamber, trusting him to complete this task. He thought of their future together, the challenges they would face as the valley's guardians. He thought of love that transcended size and prejudice and fear. His palms made contact with the crystal. The world exploded into sensation. Energy rushed through him like a flood breaking through a dam. He saw visions, generations of giants performing this ritual, their enormous hands pressed against the root just as his were now. He felt the valley's life force flowing through invisible channels in the stone, branching out like roots of a massive tree. He experienced the mountain's awareness, ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. It was judging him, measuring his worth, determining if his bond with Clarissa was genuine or merely circumstantial. Jack opened his mouth and spoke, his voice echoing strangely in the small space. Jack Wheeler and Clarissa of the Mountain Giants. We are joined. We are one. We claim this bond and offer ourselves as guardians of the valley's heart. The crystal pulsed brighter, so bright he had to close his eyes. Heat intensified until his palms felt like they would blister. Then, suddenly, it subsided. The light dimmed to its previous rhythm. Jack staggered back, his hands marked with faint glowing patterns that faded even as he watched. It was done. The magic had accepted them. Jack turned to leave, expecting to retrace his painful journey through the narrow passage. But the wall where he'd entered was gone. In its place stood a smooth vertical shaft rising straight up, illuminated by the same blue-white glow as the crystal root. He stared in confusion until understanding dawned. The mountain had accepted their bond, and now it offered him a different path. He looked up into the shaft, seeing handholds carved into the stone at regular intervals, sized perfectly for human hands. He began to climb. The ascent was challenging but nothing compared to the crushing passage he'd endured to reach the root. His arms burned with exertion, his fingers finding purchase in the carved grips. The shaft rose steadily, and as he climbed, he heard something that made his heart soar. Clarissa's voice, calling his name, the sound filtering down from above. She had found him, or rather, the mountain had brought them back together. He emerged into a different chamber than the one he'd left. This space was smaller, more intimate, its walls covered in ancient carvings that depicted giants and humans working together. In the center of the chamber, Clarissa waited, tears streaming down her face. She'd apparently been brought here by another path, the mountain manipulating its internal geography to reunite them. The moment Jack cleared the shaft's opening, she scooped him up in her hands, holding him against her chest as sobs of relief shook her massive frame. I felt it when you touched the root, she said between gasps. The connection surged through me. I saw what you saw, felt what you felt. Jack, the mountain showed me your heart. It showed me everything you sacrificed to reach the crystal, every moment of fear you pushed through for us. She pulled back to look at him, her giant eyes red from crying. I've never been so terrified in my life. Jack reached up to touch her face, his small hand barely covering her cheek. Neither have I, he admitted. But we did it. The valley is saved. Our bond is recognized by the old magic. We're truly married now, in every sense that matters. They made their way toward the surface using passages that seemed to open before them and close behind. The mountain was guiding them, showing them the safe route home. As they walked, Clarissa explained what she'd experienced while waiting in the lower chamber. The stone beneath her had grown warm, and voices had whispered in the ancient language of her people. They told her of the responsibility she and Jack now carried, the role they would play as the valley's protectors. Every 7 years, they would need to return to the heart chamber and renew their bond with the crystal root. If they failed, or if their love proved false, the magic would fade and the valley would die. It was a burden that would define their lives together, but also a purpose that gave their union meaning beyond personal happiness. They were guardians now, keepers of an ancient trust. They emerged from the mountain as night fully claimed the sky. Stars blazed overhead in the clear mountain air, more beautiful than Jack had ever seen them. The wedding guests had kept vigil at the mountain's base, maintaining bonfires and waiting anxiously for any sign of the newlyweds. When Clarissa appeared with Jack safe in her arms, a cheer went up that echoed across the valley. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Redemption Creek had witnessed. The townsfolk brought out food and drink, musicians played fiddles and guitars, and people danced around the fires until dawn threatened the eastern horizon. Clarissa sat with her back against a massive boulder, Jack nestled in the curve of her arm, and they watched their community celebrate their survival. For the first time, the boundary between giant and human seemed to dissolve. Children climbed on Clarissa's legs, using her as a living mountain to play upon. Adults shared stories with Jack, no longer seeing him as the fool who married above his station but as the hero who descended into darkness for love. As the party continued, an old woman approached Clarissa. She was one of the valley's elders, a keeper of oral histories. She looked up at the giant bride with knowing eyes. Your grandmother performed the last bonding ritual, the old woman said. 70 years ago, when she married one of my people. That magic has sustained us all this time, but it was fading. We felt it in the springs running dry, in the crops struggling. You've renewed what she began. You've given us another generation of life. Clarissa listened with wonder. Her grandmother's story had been kept from her, deemed too scandalous to share with a young giant girl. But now the truth emerged. She came from a line of bridge builders, giants who chose love over isolation and in doing so preserved an entire community. The weight of this legacy settled on her shoulders, but with Jack at her side, it felt bearable. They would honor those who came before and protect those who came after. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jack and Clarissa finally retreated to the small cabin that would serve as their home. It had been modified to accommodate both of them, high ceilings for Clarissa, normal-sized furniture for Jack, and a bed specially constructed to hold them both. They collapsed together, exhausted but triumphant, their wedding day finally coming to an end. 6 months passed in quiet contentment. Jack and Clarissa settled into married life with the same determination they'd shown in the heart chamber. The valley flourished around them, streams running fuller than they had in decades, crops growing with unusual vigor. The townsfolk attributed the prosperity to good weather, but those who knew the truth understood it was the bond between giant and cowboy that sustained their land. Jack learned to navigate his new reality with grace and humor. He built a system of ladders and platforms throughout their cabin, allowing him to reach high places without constantly needing Clarissa's help. She, in turn, learned to move with extra care in the human-sized world, always conscious of her impact on fragile things. They developed their own language of gestures and accommodations, a dance of consideration that deepened their love with each passing day. The cattle ranch that Jack had managed before the wedding now thrived under their joint supervision. Clarissa could survey the entire herd from her vantage point, spotting problems before they became disasters. Jack handled the detail work, the branding and medical care and record-keeping that required precision. Together, they made the operation more successful than it had been in generations. Other ranchers began seeking their advice, and the couple found themselves at the center of a changing community. But not everyone celebrated their union. There were still those who saw Clarissa as a curiosity, a spectacle to be gawked at rather than a person worthy of respect. And there were giants from distant mountains who sent word of their disapproval, claiming Clarissa had betrayed her bloodline by marrying below her station. These voices of dissent created tension that occasionally erupted into confrontation. One such confrontation came on a market day in Redemption Creek. A traveling merchant, new to the area, made crude jokes about Clarissa's size within her hearing. Jack confronted the man immediately, his hand resting on his belt near his knife. The merchant laughed, dismissing the cowboy as insignificant. What happened next became legend in the valley. Jack didn't raise his voice or draw his weapon. He simply stood his ground and spoke with quiet intensity about the woman he loved, about her strength and kindness and courage. He talked about descending into the mountain's heart, about touching the crystal root, about the magic that bound them together. His words carried such conviction that a crowd gathered, and even the merchant fell silent. When Jack finished, Clarissa stepped forward and placed her hand on his shoulder, and the gesture said everything about their partnership. The merchant apologized and left town that afternoon, chastened by what he'd witnessed. But more importantly, the incident solidified something crucial in the community's perception. Jack and Clarissa weren't just a married couple managing the peculiarities of their size difference. They were a unit, complete and unbreakable, stronger together than either could be alone. That understanding rippled outward, changing attitudes and opening minds. As spring turned to summer, Clarissa discovered she was pregnant. The revelation came with joy and terror in equal measure. No giant had ever borne a child fathered by a human. The medical unknowns were vast and frightening. Would the child be giant-sized? Human-sized? Something in between? The local doctor admitted his complete lack of knowledge on the subject. They would be navigating uncharted territory, guided only by hope and determination. Clarissa's pregnancy progressed normally at first, though her size made everything more complicated. She needed enormous quantities of food, and her emotional swings were proportionally dramatic, filling entire rooms with her moods. Jack devoted himself to her comfort, reading everything he could find about pregnancy and childbirth, adapting the information to their unique situation. They converted the barn into a birthing space, with the help of the community building a bed large enough for Clarissa and equipment scaled to her dimensions. 8 months into the pregnancy, the mountain spoke again. Tremors rolled through the valley, gentle but insistent. Clarissa woke one night with certainty burning in her chest. "The baby is coming," she told Jack. "And the mountain wants to witness it." They made the journey to the heart chambers entrance that same night, Clarissa moving slowly under the weight of her pregnancy, Jack riding on her shoulder with their supplies. The path seemed easier this time, as if the mountain itself aided their progress. They descended into the earth once more, following luminescent veins of crystal that had appeared since their last visit. The passages led them to a vast chamber they'd never seen before, its ceiling lost in darkness, its floor covered in soft sand. There, deep in the mountain's embrace, Clarissa gave birth as the crystal root pulsed with sympathetic light. The labor was long and difficult, hours of struggle that tested every ounce of her strength. Jack remained at her side throughout, offering water and encouragement, his small hands gripping her finger when the pain became overwhelming. He felt utterly helpless, unable to take away her suffering, able only to witness and support. When the baby finally arrived, sliding into the world on a tide of pain and relief, they discovered the mountain's final gift. The child was perfect, sized exactly between giant and human. She would grow to perhaps 8 feet tall, large enough to inherit her mother's strength but small enough to navigate the human world. She was the bridge made flesh, the living embodiment of their love and the valley's future. Clarissa cradled the baby against her chest, tears streaming freely down her face. Jack climbed up to join them, perching on Clarissa's arm to look down at their daughter. She had his blue eyes and her mother's strong features, a combination that was heartbreakingly beautiful. The crystal root's light intensified, bathing all 3 of them in its glow, and they felt the magic solidify around their family. This child would be special, touched by the valley's ancient power, destined for things they couldn't yet imagine. They named her Dawn, for she represented a new beginning. As they prepared to leave the heart chamber, carrying their daughter toward the surface world, Jack reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He thought about the wedding day that seemed impossibly long ago, about descending into darkness to touch the crystal root, about every moment of doubt and fear he'd overcome. He looked at Clarissa, this impossible woman who had chosen him, and at Dawn, their impossible daughter, and felt complete. The valley awaited them above, ready to embrace its newest guardian. Jack Wheeler, the cowboy who'd gone deep into the mountain to reach what others couldn't, had found far more than magic in the darkness. He'd found purpose, partnership, and a love that literally sustained the land itself. As they emerged into the morning light, the 3 of them together, the sun broke through clouds and painted the world in gold. It was a promise, Jack thought, of all the tomorrows yet to come.